If your opponent is a weak player, you can play against 20, 30 people at the same time and basically just play the first move that comes to your mind, and you are going to win most of the games.
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 193rd episode of this podcast dedicated to anything and everything that you can do to help assist the better workings of your brain, maybe in the process making you a brain expert. We're going to be talking in this episode specifically about the concept of expertise, learning, skill transfer, what works, what doesn't, talking with a couple of researchers on the topic, one of whom is actually a former chess champion, Doctors Fernand Gobet and Giovanni Sala. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, keeping you up to date as you always want to be on the dietary inclinations of mice, I'm going to tell you about a new finding, very counterintuitive and interesting, about how the sense of smell impacts how much weight mice gain from their food. But for right now, let's kick things off as usual with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So August 13th is International Left-Handers Day, and I've been mentioning for a couple of weeks I wanted to do something for the lefties out there. Whether you're left or right-handed is determined by your brain's level of lateralization, and a person's handedness has been correlated with all sorts of things, from spatial abilities to creativity and artistic inclinations to mathematical ability. And it just so happens that our two guests in this episode, Dr. Gobet and PhD candidate Giovanni Sala, have very recently, just in June of this year, published a paper on handedness and mathematical ability with the synopsis-like title, "The relationship between handedness and mathematics is nonlinear and is moderated by gender, age, and type of task." There are a variety of competing theories about how handedness affects cognition. One popular model is called the right shift theory, introduced in the 1980s, in which a combination of genetic and environmental factors determine a person's handedness, and the theory predicts a general cognitive advantage for moderate right-handers, for people that are slightly right-handed but not overwhelmingly so. There's been some evidence to support this, with spatial ability in moderate right-handers found to be superior among a sample of 14 to 15-year-olds. Another line of research, also from the 80s, claimed that left-handedness is a predictor of mathematical precociousness in young students. A study supporting that idea found that the rates of left-handers among talented students in math was much higher than among the general population. The relationship between left-handedness and giftedness occurred in several domains, including music, chess, and art, as well as math. But more recently, in 2015, two meta-analyses reported that left-handers were overrepresented among intellectually challenged individuals and actually did slightly worse in spatial ability tasks. And finally, there's a theory called the hemispheric indecision hypothesis, which focuses on handedness as a spectrum rather than a binary choice between right and left, and proposes that a strong choice in either direction for the left or the right for the area of operations for any particular type of task removes redundancy within the brain and ultimately becomes a more efficient choice. Proponents of this theory point out that weak lateralization, not favoring one side strongly over the other, tends to be correlated with delays in development. Among 11-year-olds, children that showed no particular preference between the right and left hands, that fact could be accurately used to predict deficits in verbal, nonverbal, and mathematical abilities. Follow-up studies showed that children who straddled the line between left and right-handers also performed worse in memory and reasoning tasks. So in this current study, most recently published, several hundred Italian students between the ages of 6 and 17 participated in 5 experiments. Not all kids were in all experiments, so the numbers of participants in any given experiment were between about 2 and 600 kids. And this study was looking exclusively at the link between mathematical ability and handedness, but it did break down mathematical ability in a variety of ways. There were things like logical reasoning, problem solving, arithmetic, geometry, and spatial analysis, recognizing that the umbrella term of math is a little too all-encompassing. And the picture that emerged was, yes, definitively handedness does matter in a person's mathematical abilities, but the ways that it matters are extremely complex. It's not just a matter of left-handers are good at math, or even that left-handers are good at a particular type of math. They put their data points on a plot, but they could not really fit the data to either a straight linear or a quadratic formula. They needed to use 3rd and 4th level polynomial functions. But when they did that, they actually got a somewhat tighter mapping to the data. And if they knew a kid's age, sex, and the type of math problem that they were being tested in, they could make those predictions between 3 and 10% more accurately if they also knew the kid's handedness, which made handedness not a definitive predictor of mathematical ability, but a factor worth taking into account, and that number between 3 and 10% was a lot higher than the 1% proposed by earlier studies. But what those earlier studies weren't taking into account was breaking the groups down by age, by the type of math problem, by the student's sex, etc. So a complicated picture, but yes, handedness does matter, not hugely, but measurably.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes. Listener Listoval from the USA said, "Awesome podcast with interesting and useful information, but don't be afraid of letting it run longer. We like it when you go deep." Okay, mental note made. And JW from Australia says, "Massive fan. I love the podcast. I'm doing a biotech and chemistry degree, so endlessly fascinated by the caliber of the guests and Jesse's ability to communicate with them and to us. And cheers to the post-production crew, too." Well, I'll second that. A big thank you to Anushtup, our editor, who's behind the scenes doing heroic labors of editing week in, week out. Episodes like this one where we interview and intercut a couple of different guests are extra work. And we've got a big one coming up in the next couple of episodes. In fact, we're probably going to be doing something special for episode number 200 in a couple of months here. Also have plans for another User Perspectives episode. We did that on Adderall back in episode number 98. I really liked the format for that episode. It was sort of a one-off, but probably one of my 10 favorite episodes if you wanted to go back into the Smart Drug Smarts treasure trove. I want to do a similar episode on psychedelics soon, so Anushtup is going to have his hands full editing that one, I'm sure already. Anushtup salary, as well as all the other shekels and doubloons that make this podcast possible, are paid for by the proceeds from axonlabs.io. Axon Labs is the retail end of things over here at Smart Drug Smarts. We've got a couple of nootropic stacks there, Mitogen and Nexus. And we're getting ready to do some shucking and jive and make some pretty large improvements to that website. It's been a while since we did a spring cleaning over there, but if you want to do a before and after, then now is a great time for the before look over at axonlabs.io. Here at Smart Drug Smarts, we are also deeply enamored of our new supplement partner, Vitamunk, a supplement company with a really broad range of products, growing broader almost by the week, and a great team of people. I'm sitting on calls with them every week, hearing about their processes, what they're doing, the steps that they're taking for quality assurance and product development. I've talked about their launch list in the past, so I won't belabor that point here, but you can find out about that at smartdrugsmarts.com/launch. Or if you're just curious about how the relationship formed between us and Vitamunk, we put up a page on that at smartdrugsmarts.com/Vitamunk. Vita is in vitamin, monk is in Shaolin monk.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So in this episode, we're going to be speaking with a couple of meta-experts. A meta-expert, as you might expect, is an expert on expertise itself. Just why and how people are able to get extremely good at their chosen field of endeavor, or in some cases, not even chosen. Sometimes you might gain expertise in something that, although you don't have a passion for, it just seems as if you're born for. That interplay of talent versus passion is certainly something that comes up again and again in the study of expertise. There are going to be 2 interviews here. We're going to be talking with Dr. Fernand Gobet, who, in addition to being a former chess champion, which he'll be talking about throughout his interview, is also the author of the book Understanding Expertise, and a PhD student studying under him, Giovanni Sala. I think it'll always be pretty clear who's who, and we'll be talking about how expertise is gained, how expertise transfers between different domains. You'll hear reference to Dr. Anders Ericsson's work in deliberate practice. Our episode number 128 was with Dr. Ericsson. He's another one of the heavyweights in this field, and you'll find that there's a large amount of overlap, but also some points of contrast between Dr. Gobet's and Dr. Ericsson's views on expertise. A quick point of terminology. We've talked about the Stroop effect on a variety of earlier podcasts, but that's dropped in this conversation as well without lead-in or preamble, so I wanted to just let you know what that is in case you haven't heard those other episodes. The Stroop test is fairly famous in psychological science. It basically comes down to reading the words for certain colors printed in either a matching color or a different color. For example, if you read the word blue, but it's written in a red font, it takes you more time to process and read that word if it's in a contrasting color. Basically, if it's the wrong color for the word, you can't stop your mind from doing a bit of a double take, even if either the color or the word is really irrelevant to the task you're trying to perform. It's one of the rare cases where it actually helps to be either colorblind or illiterate. So anyway, when Dr. Gobet says Stroop effect, that's what he's talking about. So get ready to gain some meta expertise yourself, and here we go with Dr. Fernand Gobet and Giovanni Sala.
My first passion was actually the game of chess. And when I was a teenager, I spent a lot of time playing chess. I was a Swiss champion at some point. I reached the title of an international master. I played for the Swiss national team. Mm-hmm. And then when I was playing chess, I always had the question, why do some people play better than me, for example? Also, I was interested in psychology. So I studied psychology at the university. And very early on, I was able actually to write some paper about one aspect of the psychology of chess. And since then, I've always kind of mixed psychology and my interest in chess.
What has been the consensus view as far as training for cognitively demanding tasks and what sorts of skill transfer a person might reasonably expect?
Basically, the idea is always the same, regardless of the type of training. You train in a cognitively demanding task or activity, let's say, working memory training, music training, chess training, video game training, and so on and so forth, and you train your brain like a muscle or something like that, technically we can say that the idea is to train domain general abilities, cognitive abilities, with domain-specific tasks, with the idea to get domain general benefits, cognitive benefits. That's the idea of cognitive enhancement, cognitive training. But long story short, this basically doesn't work, or it doesn't work like that at least.
So here I need to explain the idea of far transfer and near transfer. Near transfer is the idea that if you study a topic like chess, for example, you are going to be better in a topic which is very close to chess, maybe Chinese chess. Far transfer is the idea that if you study a topic, again, like chess, then you are better in the domain that has very few connections with the first domain, like mathematics, for example. And of course, far transfer would be great, because if far transfer was possible, then children, for example, could learn mathematics by playing chess, and then they don't have to go through the kind of very hard and boring task of learning multiplications and other things. And it's probably easier to motivate children to play music or to play chess than to learn mathematics or Latin.
Yeah, a whole lot easier, I think.
Yeah, sure.
Chess is one of these interesting domains, and there don't seem to be a huge amount of them where you do have child prodigies, kids that just have phenomenal levels of ability. What are some of the common hallmarks of those sorts of domains where you have standout kids as opposed to something like novel writing where you don't see the 10-year-old prodigy novelist?
Yeah, there tend to be domains that are fairly self-contained. Well, other examples are mathematics and music. So in music, for example, you can learn to play music at a very high level, but you don't really need to make connection with the world in general. And that's the same with the chess. You can play chess very well, but again, that's a domain that's totally self-contained. And when you gave the example of writing a novel, of course, to write a novel, you need to understand a lot about people, about the world, and so on. And that takes quite a long time to acquire this kind of knowledge. So I think that's the basic big difference between the domains where you find child prodigies and the domains where you don't find such people.
What have been some of the specific experiments that you've used to debunk the idea that this sort of generalized improvement can be effective?
Well, my supervisor and I collected all the studies, the experimental studies, so the treatment studies related to cognitive training in several types of training. We started with chess, then we've moved to music, working memory training, and now we are just taking a look at other types of training. But I'm sticking to the published papers. And in all these domains, in all these activities, the studies offered a mixed picture. Some study said that the training was working. Some study stated that the training was not working or was kind of working, and so on. So we built several statistical models. Technically, we are talking about meta-analysis, which is basically merging all the results from different studies and tried to explain the reason of this heterogeneity, or this between study heterogeneity. And the reason was always the same, the quality of the experimental design. When the experimental design was very good, the effects were zero. So no effect at all of the training. When the experimental design at least was not perfect, the effects were larger. So basically the reason of the heterogeneity is the quality of the design. And more specifically, the point is to try to rule out potential placebo effects in this kind of training. Because, if you take a few people and they start the training, generally they start this new activity with some excitement and maybe with some expectations. And this is going to affect the performance after the training. To control for these placebo effects, just like in medicine, you need a group doing another activity, we consider a placebo activity, and see whether they get the same effect of the experimental group. And when these trainings were compared to the placebos, the effects were close to zero and sometimes even less than zero.
In one of the early chapters of your book, the sentence came up, I think it was, perception is at the heart of expertise. And I thought that was an interesting concept and was wondering if you could unpack that a bit.
Okay, that's probably the main result of research into expertise. And that was really discovered by Adrian de Groot in 1945-46. When he talks about perception, it's a much more abstract level of perception. And the idea is that when experts in almost any kind of domain, when they look at a problem, they basically really see the problem in a different way. So if you take a chess position and you show it to a weak player, the player is going to see, well, there is a knight here, a bishop here, a queen here, and so on and so forth. While a strong player or grandmaster is going to see the position really as a combination of ideas, possible movements, forces, and so on. And of course, concepts. And this is absolutely automatic. So, for example, if you show a position for a few seconds and you tell the player, let's say a grandmaster, well, the only thing you have to do is to try to remember this position. Don't try to understand anything about it. The player cannot stop really thinking in terms of concepts and so on. So the player can tell you anything about the game, the moves that led to the position, what you should do, and so on and so forth.
It's like it's really hard to view a word without reading the word. If it's a language you understand, you can't just look at the shapes of the letters and not have the word pop into your mind.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a kind of a Stroop effect, if you want. So that's actually a very good example that, well, with the experts in all domains, basically, they have learned the language and they cannot stop using this language, even if you tell them not to use it.
For a meta-analysis that's looking at the experiment quality of other experiments, I mean, that's a difficult thing to quantify. You could kind of look at a given experiment's design and sort of make a qualitative judgment call on is this good or bad, but to try to do a group analysis of experiment design, that just because every experiment is going to be so different, that's difficult to apply sort of a generalized grading scale, it seems.
Well, you have statistical methods to control for these problems. In the case of meta-analysis, first of all, you can quantify the degree of true heterogeneity, because you know that sometimes studies differ from each other just because of random error. Sometimes it's just by chance.
Yeah.
But you have the possibility to calculate the true heterogeneity. When you find the true heterogeneity, you can also test the effect of these potential moderators, in our case, the presence or the absence of a placebo group, and test whether this specific moderator is significant or not, whether this moderator affects the effect sizes or not. And in our cases, it does quite clearly.
One of the points in your book that I thought was great, the turn of phrase that you used, was in expertise, the difference between knowing that versus knowing how. Declarative knowledge and rubber hitting the road, knowing how to get things done. That's a lot of the important part of what separates an expert from everybody else.
In some domains, let's say if you're an expert in history, you have to acquire a lot of knowledge and you can actually tell people what you know. So you know about dates, about mechanisms and so on, names, of course. And basically, well, you have access to your knowledge. There are other domains, most sports, where you don't have access to this kind of knowledge. So, for example, if you ask a tennis player to tell you why he can play this move so beautifully, they can tell you some kind of explanation, but it's very likely to be incorrect. And the first type of knowledge is called declarative knowledge. So you can explain what you know, you have access to it. And the second type of knowledge is called procedural knowledge or know-how. And there are very clear-cut differences between domains of expertise, between these two types of knowledge. In a domain like chess, for example, even though players have a lot of declarative knowledge, knowing that, at the same time, they have a lot of procedural knowledge, knowing how. And what I believe is that in a domain like chess, and definitely in sports, the key really is to have this procedural knowledge. And for example, in chess, you can meet many people who know a lot about the game. So they have a lot of declarative knowledge. Journalists would be an example, but they don't play the game very well. At the same time, there are some players who don't really know much about the game. They don't know the famous games and so on, but they play very well. Of course, the very good players have actually a combination of both types of knowledge. But I think the key knowledge here is the procedural knowledge. And this actually links very directly to perception. So the main theory in the domain which was proposed by Chase and Simon in 1973 is that if you're an expert in a domain, you are able to access perceptual patterns very quickly. So it's about perception. And these patterns are linked to possible actions. So in chess, if you see a given pattern, if you see an open line, for example, immediately you have the idea that you should put a rook on the open line. And the idea is that you have many such links, and many of them are totally unconscious. Well, of course, the example I gave you with occupying the column with the rook is obviously conscious. But when I play chess, very often I play moves very quickly, which tend to be good moves, but I don't really know why I play them. I just play them.
Really? Huh.
And that's really the link between perception and action. And also, actually, it's a very simple explanation of intuition. Well, intuition is almost a kind of magic word. And if you look at an expert, for example, if you look at a medical doctor, and if your problem is not too rare, so it's a relatively common problem, in a few seconds, doctor pretty much knows what you have. And the mechanism here would be the same. The doctor perceives some patterns, perceptual patterns, the color of your skin, maybe the way you walk and these kind of things. And of course, he's going to ask you a few questions if you have fever and so on. And then very quickly, he can make a connection between the patterns, the symptoms, and basically the pathology. And many domains, experts are just very good at that. And very quickly, they find the correct answer. However, when you give them problems which are more complicated, they cannot do that anymore. And they have to go back to a much more kind of analytic way of thinking. In a sense, the same kind of problem solving that the non-experts would be doing.
As a non-chess expert myself, hearing you say that you would make moves intuitively without then going back and doing the rational analysis of, am I stepping into a trap here? It reminds me of jazz players in music, where they don't necessarily know where the notes are going to be taking them. They just sort of intuitively feel that it's safe to go in this direction.
Yeah, the mechanism at some level will be the same as in jazz. Of course, in chess, if you have time, then you can go back to some more analytical way of thinking, which is called search. And in particular, if your opponent is a very strong player, then you don't rely only on your intuition. If your opponent is a weak player, you can play against 20, 30 people at the same time, and basically just play the first move that comes to your mind, and you are going to win most of the games. So intuition, really, this pattern recognition mechanism accounts for a fair amount of your expertise. However, if you play against a strong player, the other player would have the same kind of intuition. So you have to do something else, which is, of course, to look ahead, anticipate moves. So if I play my knight here, it takes my bishop, and so on and so forth. And you do this kind of look ahead search. Now, where things get a bit murky is that there is not one way of thinking which is intuitive and the other way which is purely analytical. In fact, both are going to be mixed together most of the time. So if I play chess against a grandmaster, my intuition is going to propose me a few moves, or one move, let's say. I play this move in my mind's eye, and then I look at what my opponent could play. And then intuition is going to kick in again. So intuition is going to tell me, well, my opponent could play this move. So I play this move in my mind's eye. And again, intuition could propose another move for me, and I keep doing that. So both intuition or pattern recognition and search really kind of interleaved. And I think that happens in many domains. By the way, this is why I believe that some of the very current theories and very important theories at the moment, which are, for example, called System 1 and System 2, are just too simple. So System 1 is basically the intuitive way of thinking, and System 2 is the more kind of rational way of thinking. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that sometimes you are in System 1 and sometimes in System 2. Both modes of thinking are going to be combined most of the time. So it's not that now I can be in pure intuitive mode and now in pure rational mode. Again, at least when you solve non-trivial problems, you will have to do both almost at the same time.
Would you say that that sort of system to analytical method of thinking, is expertise possible in the same way? Or is that when everybody, even an expert within a domain, is forced to sort of brute force the problem and think in terms of search?
Well, in many cases, you can actually reach a very high level only with the System 1, so the pattern recognition. So, well, in chess, for example, a grandmaster can probably beat a good amateur just by pattern recognition. I would say, if anything, expertise is more in System 1 than System 2. And if you do only System 2, then it's very, very hard to be an expert, because then it's a pure kind of brute force kind of search, and humans are not very good at that. Well, computers are very good at that. And for example, when Deep Blue beat Kasparov, it was pure search. So if you want System 2, but humans are very limited in what they can do.
Recently, people are much less optimistic about something like brain training or working memory training. It's just because of the failure of the replications. Basically, people have failed to replicate the initial positive results because they use better designs. And, sometimes it's also a bit difficult to organize the perfect treatment study. And it's much easier to control the effects of a treatment with a no-contact control group than a placebo control group, obviously, because you've got to organize another activity and you've got to, hope that this activity is going to be attended by the participants and so on. So it's not easy at all. But still, the problem is that we need this type of quality to assess treatments. Just like with drugs, for example, we need the control for placebos, and there's not much that we can do about it.
I'm hearing all this and feeling bad for the parents that are paying for piano lessons for their kids or for chess lessons, looking for things that they think are going to make their kid generally smarter in school and get all these knock-on benefits in other areas. Is there any silver lining for that sort of thinking?
Well, first of all, people training with piano lessons are going to learn how to play the piano, which is not that bad at all. And the same applies to chess and also brain training. If you, have fun playing brain training games, just do it. Who cares? You can have some kind of transfer, whether the activity tasks overlap with other type of tasks. A classical example is arithmetic and geometry and chess. In that case, you play chess on a chessboard, which is basically geometrical space. Okay, with some properties and so on.
You don't get much more Cartesian than a chessboard.
Yeah, exactly. And if you play this kind of game, so you might expect some benefits in some specific tasks, just like reading Cartesian graphs and so on. But we are not saying that transfer is impossible. We are just saying that transfer is a function of the overlap between two activities. So if there is an overlap, if I drive a car, I'm going to drive another type of car, more or less equally. But this is called a near transfer, actually, when you have a kind of transfer, because two activities are quite close to each other, quite similar to each other.
The default assumption is that there is a fair amount of transfer between different skills. So if you learn to play chess, you are going to be good in mathematics and music and creativity and so on and so forth. And quite a while ago, almost 20 years ago, I did a review of the literature about transfer in chess. And basically, I didn't find much evidence about that. And even though there were many papers, the quality of the studies, of most of the studies, was very poor. And if you look at the best studies, then the evidence was not strong at all. And for many years, I didn't do much about it. But then Giovanni came and I had the opportunity to study this in more detail. And the news are very disappointing, I would say, because in most of our research, basically, we have found that there is no far transfer.
In 1982, a study showed that with a bit of training, with a few weeks of training, I was able to remember something like 80 or 100 digits to recall from memory, 100 digits just dictated by an experimenter. The point is that this capability was very domain-specific, was amazing, but domain-specific. In fact, when they tried to do the same with colors and not with digits, the experimenter and the subject found out that the subject just couldn't do it. So it's, training is useful, but you can't expect miracles out of it. Do you know what I mean?
Probably internally he had some sort of heuristic that he'd come up with for remembering those numbers quickly. And maybe if he had some sort of number to color mapping, he would have been able to use the same technique, but he wasn't able to jury rig something and come up with that mapping on the fly under the time pressure.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, you've got to retrain in a sense. You've got to train again with colors because you've got to form different kinds of trivial structures.
Why is it that the folk wisdom that sort of far transfer does exist is so pervasive?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer. Probably it's part of our culture that, for example, we are taught in school that what we are learning in school is going to be useful for our life and so on and so forth. So implicit, there's the idea that there is a far transfer. I can tell you, however, why most likely there is no far transfer. The reason is that, as I said at the beginning, the key to become an expert is to acquire this perceptual knowledge. And this knowledge is going to be very specific to the domain. So if you play chess, the knowledge is going to be about the position of pieces and possible combinations. If you learn to play basketball, for example, again, the knowledge is going to be very specific about some types of actions, about tactics and so on. And these actions and tactics are going to apply only to basketball. They are not even going to apply to football or volleyball. And the same with chess. So basically what you acquire is a very large number of patterns. Also, you acquire links between patterns and actions. And all this is incredibly specific. And the more expert you become in a domain, basically the more of this information you acquire. And because this information is so specific, it's very unlikely that you can apply it to any kind of other domain. So in a sense, while it's disappointing that far transfer doesn't exist, this is very good news for the kind of theory I propose, because it's a very direct support for these theories that basically expertise is highly perceptual, and that in order to become an expert, you need to acquire a very large number of patterns.
let's say somebody is ambivalent about where they want to gain expertise, but they realize based on their genetics and personal background and whatever it might be, they have sort of this baseline of areas where maybe they've got some predisposition. How might somebody recognize where their natural strengths and advantages give them the ability to maybe gain a higher level of expertise or acquire expertise more quickly?
Well, first, definitely I do believe that there is something called talent, and that some people are better in some domains than other people. But I would say you would be probably better just to follow your instincts. So if you think that you are good at chess and you enjoy chess, then just do it. However, somebody tells you, well, you should learn to play chess because it's great for mathematics and so on, and you really hate chess, I don't think it's a very good start. So you should really listen to what you like and also where you think you are more gifted than other people. Now, of course, your intuitions about your gifts might be wrong, but I don't think you should ignore them totally. Also, don't forget that if you really want to become a top expert in a domain, you will have to spend a lot of time. And some people have proposed that it's going to take 10 years or 10,000 hours to be an expert. The exact number doesn't matter that much, but what matters is that you will have to spend a huge amount of time. And if you don't really like what you are doing, it's going to be very hard actually to carry out this activity for that many hours. I would say choose the domain that you like. Of course, not all the learning is going to be fun. You will have to concentrate, to repeat, for example, the same action in tennis many times. But if from the start you don't like the domain, I don't think it's a very good start. Whether people will become experts in the domain, whether they totally hated practice or not, is a subject of debate. People like Anders Ericsson argue that deliberate practice, this kind of goal-directed practice where you get feedback and where you spend a lot of time practicing, they argue that basically this type of practice is not enjoyable, that most of the people who do that hate the practice. However, this is not totally true. And there are many papers, many of them in sports, reporting data clearly indicating that people who became experts in football, for example, did enjoy practicing the same skill again and again. But a very good example is David Beckham in football, practiced massively free kicks, and he was one of the best in the world for this. And he said he enjoyed it. And there's also a very famous swimmer who said that the best time of his life is when he's alone in the swimming pool swimming and practicing. So it's very hard. It's not just swimming for fun. It's deliberate practice. However, he did enjoy this kind of practice. So I think it's more a question of personality. Some people enjoy this kind of practice and other people don't enjoy it. So in fact, some people enjoy it so much that they try to get this practice. And there is something called the phenomenon of flow proposed by Csikszentmihalyi, which is the idea that when you are totally absorbed in what you are doing, you forget about everything else. You forget even about eating and drinking, and you forget about time. And some people really enjoy practice because they have this kind of flow phenomenon.
Is there any correlation between personality types and people who gain high levels of expertise? I was wondering about that as you were describing how some people enjoy their practice while others really might be grinding it out.
Well, there's a lot of variability, and also it depends on the domain. So the kind of personality that you would have in marketing, for example, would not be the same as in mathematics. However, in general, experts tend to be introvert. And the reason I think is that if you spend so much time practicing, you have to enjoy being alone and doing the same thing again and again. Again, there are many exceptions, but if you are somebody who is very extrovert, it's a bit difficult to spend 4 hours a day just practicing the piano, for example. So I would say this is the main characteristic. There are a few other traits, though. For example, many experts really have a rage to master their domain. So they really want to be the best. They are very ambitious, at least for their domain, very competitive. That you definitely find in many domains. Obviously, in sports, you would find that. But even in music, in science, many scientists are very competitive as well.
Has there been pushback against the findings from your meta-analysis? Are there people who are saying that far transfer is a real thing and sign up your kids for piano lessons now? I'm unfairly picking on piano lessons, but basically people that think you're overstating your case?
Well, yeah. I mean, some people don't like this idea. Some people are just surprised because they were expecting some transfer. And I've got to be honest, even I and my co-author were quite surprised. And some other people got angry, especially because many careers in university, have been built on the hope of far transfer to be true, to occur.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those things where you can understand why everybody would be rooting for FAR transfer to work. Everything from your local piano teacher to university researchers and every parent that's planning to put their kid in some sort of extracurricular activity.
Well, I can tell you a nice anecdote about that. In my hometown, when I was about to get into middle school, I tried to get into the music curriculum, because there were two curriculums, the regular one and the musical one, and I got rejected. And I tried back then just because parents in general and teachers and so on were pushing the students to try, because music is getting you smart, because music can make you smarter, and this kind of arguments and so on. And then I got rejected. We can say that I'm getting my revenge after 20 years.
Yeah, motivated research.
Just kidding, obviously. But it was just an anecdote to convey this point. And the point is that the fact that if you train your brain on something and you're going to get a stronger brain is extremely rooted, and not only among some academics, but the general population.
It is a very deeply rooted idea. And is this just based on the fact, the observation that's easy to make, that if somebody's good at one thing, they tend to be good at a lot of other things also?
Well, basically, bullseye. It's exactly that. There is a difference between correlational and experimental data. There are chess players who are quite intelligent, and there is a correlation between chess skill and fluid intelligence, for example, and also memory and other cognitive abilities. But the point is that obvious explanation, if you don't believe in FAR transfer, that there is a correlation between chess skill and intelligence, just because more intelligent people tend to be stronger at chess, not because chess has made these people smarter, more intelligent. Psychologically, there is a tendency to assume causality when you see two concurrent events.
Right.
It's very natural to establish a link of causality.
Do you believe that expertise at some level is within everybody's grasp if they apply enough training, enough practice perceiving the world and building up their intuitions within a domain? Is effort enough at some level?
Well, it depends how exactly you define expertise, I guess. If by expertise you mean the very top level, like world champion, it's clear that some people are never going to be world champion in most domains, I would say. If you define expertise as being better than the average, then probably most people can be an expert. But even this level of expertise would be very far from the top level in their field.
Obviously, in a planet of 7 going on 8 billion people, getting to the top of any one particular apex is very difficult. But I think for most people, kind of getting to the top 1% or 0.1% within their area of interest is probably enough to feel pretty self-satisfied. I'm just sort of wondering, that middling level of expertise is generally achievable given enough exertion.
Yeah, I think this is definitely possible. I'm not saying that it's going to be easy. And again, you probably have to practice quite a lot using rapid feedback and so on and so forth. That's probably one of the correct kind of conclusions of the framework of deliberate practice, that most people underestimate how far they can go in any kind of domain. At the same time, there are also limits as well. So, for example, I love running and I run marathons, but there are clearly limits in how far I can go. Well, in my case, there is obviously the problem of age, but my morphology is probably not ideal for a runner. And you might practice as much as you can. You cannot correct that. And that's the point where I really disagree with Anders Ericsson, because he really proposes that anybody can really be the best in any domain, or almost any domain. And I think, it's simply not the case, but there is a kind of almost logical way to show that this is not possible. Let's say you have two people who are interested in becoming a very good chess player, and one has an IQ of 100 and the other one has an IQ of 130. And we know that chess is correlated with IQ. So more intelligent people tend to be better at chess. So both are going to practice. And if the first one, who has an IQ of 100, practices more than the second one who has an IQ of 130, then the first one can catch the second one, even though his IQ is smaller. However, if the one with the higher IQ is also practicing at the same rate, this person is always going to keep some kind of advantage. This interaction between talent and practice, in my view, is really the key question in the domain. Of course, it's very hard to study, but until we really understand what's going on with this interaction, I don't think we are even close to understand or to become really an expert.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So a big thanks to both Dr. Fernand Gobet and Giovanni Sala for taking the time for those interviews. It's always nice to hear from somebody that practices what they preach, in this case being an actual practitioner of expertise in chess, as well as somebody who studies expertise in its generalized Platonic form. I think you could hear about probably 10 minutes into that interview where I was taken aback when he said that he played good moves in chess without knowing exactly why he was playing them, which is fascinating to think about. I mean, it's probably a very common thing that when you're not an expert in something, as I'm certainly not when it comes to chess, you sort of have no choice but to be meticulous and rigorous in thinking your way through things, if you choose to think about them at all. Whereas a true expert can make it look easy, and to a certain extent from their conscious processing, it really is easy because there's not conscious deliberative thought going into it in the same way. Of course, the experts have put in their deliberative hours much earlier, probably for years at a time before they would be considered experts. So kind of bad news, I guess, about the undermining of the idea that far transfer might be a realistic goal, gaining skills in one area and passing them on to other areas like Johnny Appleseed. But I guess the two main takeaways from that are A, pick your domain carefully because limited transfer within regional domains certainly is possible. And also, of course, doing whatever you can to maximize general intelligence, which is the one thing that really does make its presence felt across pretty much all cognitive domains. And now switching gears because we've said almost nothing so far about mice in this episode, and I'm starting to feel like no episode is complete without reference to a mouse study. Let's move on to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So people are very familiar with the idea that caloric consumption has something to do with weight gain or weight maintenance. How could it not, of course? And a lot of the debate now is about not just calories, but macronutrient ratios or timing of diet when you're eating, and a lot of fine-grained details about the food itself. But here's an odd new contender to throw into the mix as far as factors that affect whether a person, or in this case, whether a mouse puts on weight. This is a mouse study, but obviously what makes it intriguing is the extent to which it may or may not apply to humans. Mice appear to be extremely impacted in their weight gain or lack of weight gain by what they smell, independent of what they actually eat. This was a study performed at the University of California at Berkeley. This study was led by molecular biologist Andrew Dillon, and he and his team took genetically engineered mice, and they gave them regular doses of a diphtheria toxin, which temporarily suppressed their sense of smell, made them smell blind. Then some of each group got a high-fat diet, while others got a normal mouse chow diet, not overly fat-enhanced, and they were allowed to eat in this way, either smelling or not, and either eating a fatty diet or not for about 3 months, which is a lot when you're a mouse. Among the mice eating the regular diet, after 3 months' time, the smell-deprived mice weighed slightly less than the others, whereas in the high-fat group, the smellers gained a significant amount of weight, as was expected, whereas the non-smellers weighed a whopping 16% less than those who could smell eating the same diet. What the scientists suspect might be happening is that something about the sense of smell is triggering the body's digestive processes to be more accommodating of calories entering the system, and if nothing is smelled, then even if food goes down the normal digestive pipeline, the system hasn't been properly primed and not as much food is absorbed. Now, you might think that it's just not all that fun to eat food when you can't smell it, and you'd probably be right, but the actual amount of food that was consumed by the animals wasn't really changed by whether or not they could smell it. They also didn't seem to be getting any more exercise. Something, however, seemed to be causing the non-smelling mice to be using up more calories than their smelling peers. Now, here's where it gets dicey as to whether this study will actually carry over to humans. What seems to be happening is that not smelling is activating something called brown fat in mice. Brown fat is something that mice carry a lot of, that humans don't carry a lot of. Humans have a higher proportion of something called white fat, which is normally the type of fat that accumulates when humans have beer bellies or thunder thighs. Brown fat, by contrast, is specialized to produce heat through metabolism. This is one of the ways that mice regulate their internal body temperature, and you might remember that mice cannot sweat. Humans actually have a rare gift when it comes to sweating, which may be why our proportion of fat is way tilted in favor of white fat versus brown fat. According to Dillon, based on the animals in the study, not only did brown fat increase its activity in the smell-deficient animals, but white fat tissues actually started changing to behave more like brown fat. Intrigued by these findings, the scientists flipped things around and they genetically engineered a group of super-smelling mice, and these excessive smellers became obese even though they were eating the same amount of food as the other mice. Clinical neuroscientist Thomas Hummel cautions against applying these findings to humans. He and his colleagues have studied people who could no longer smell because they'd received brain injuries, and few of those people seemed to lose weight. However, other scientists see potential weight loss therapies, thinking about things like nasal sprays that might deaden odor-sensitive neurons for a few hours, possibly helping people to digestively ignore a high-calorie diet.
We like to think of ourselves as a digital speakeasy for brain hackers, but you can call us Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so that's it for episode number 193. Thank you for hanging around until the very end. If you enjoyed this episode, you will find everything that we spoke about here up online at smartdrugsmarts.com/193. And if you missed last week's episode, number 192, I spoke with Dr. Ralph Martins about the interplay of testosterone and Alzheimer's disease. Testosterone being the good guy in that equation, Alzheimer's obviously playing the villain role. And next week, if all goes as planned, going to be talking about implantable brain technologies, some of which are still sci-fi speculation and some of which are already here. We'll be talking with an engineer who designs such things, so get yourself primed for that. And I will see you back here, same time, same podcast, and with that same unwavering commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only. Although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.